Continuing with the same example, let's think about the welfare impacts of monopolies. Remember that we measure welfare using surplus, and we can calculate here consumer, producer, and total surplus in the case where we have a monopoly market. We would also like to compare that to the outcome if the market had been perfectly competitive, which we know would be the socially optimal outcome. So what we have, if we have a perfectly competitive market, is price equal to marginal cost or supply equal to demand, some way of thinking about that as perfect competition or the socially optimal outcome. It's socially optimal for us to continue to produce and sell the product as long as the value to the consumer, the price, is greater than the marginal cost of production. This should say marginal cost. So here's demand that represents the value to the consumer and the price they're willing to pay. Here's marginal cost. As long as it's larger, we should continue to produce, and that stops being true here. Remember that in competitive markets, we can think about our supply curve as being equal to marginal cost. And so this is the socially optimal quantity here. And we can solve by that simply by taking our demand curve and setting it equal to marginal cost. You can see that that quantity there is 100. And if I were to think about total surplus at that point, I would have consumer surplus, the area above the price and below this demand curve. Producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve. And total surplus would extend all the way out to that 100 units of quantity. We get there by setting a price equal to 50. Of course, the monopoly is not producing there. The monopoly is producing here at a quantity of 60, charging a price of 90. So we want to now compare surplus with the monopoly to surplus in competition. You can see that with the monopoly, the consumers are charged a higher price. Monopolies will restrict the quantity that they sell in order to raise their price and increase profit. All of that is bad for the consumer. They are able to purchase fewer units of the product and they have to pay a higher price. So with the monopoly, our consumer surplus would be equal to the area of this triangle up here. Which is 1,800. Our producer surplus is the area below the price and above the supply curve or above the marginal cost curve, which works out to be this area here. It's not a triangle, but we can divide it here. And we'd find this number by plugging 60 either into our marginal revenue or marginal cost curve. So our producer surplus is the area of the triangle plus the area of the rectangle. And that gives me 4,500. With total surplus for the monopoly being, was that 6,300? We could find total surplus at the socially optimal outcome by finding the area of that big triangle, 150 minus 0 times 100, which would give me 7,500. So the difference, the loss in surplus that results from the monopoly restriction of the quantity that they're selling, that's what we call deadweight loss. And deadweight loss most always comes from this restriction in the quantity that's sold, because what's happening here is that there are consumers who could potentially gain from purchasing this product more than the cost of producing the product. So it would be socially optimal to sell the product to those consumers, but they are unable to purchase it in this case because of the monopoly's distortion of the market. So you can find deadweight loss either by taking the difference here in total surplus or by calculating the area of that triangle, which would be 1/2 times the restriction in quantity times the difference here in the prices, and that will give us 1,200. So in general, firms with market power will sell a smaller quantity of good. They restrict the quantity, allowing them to charge a higher price than in competition, trying to increase their profits. That's good for the firm, but is bad for consumers and for society as a whole.